26 men wore the golden baton of a German field marshal under Adolf Hitler. 26 men who commanded millions of soldiers, who shaped the destiny of nations, who believed themselves untouchable by history's judgment. But by 1946, most of them were dead. Some were executed at Nuremberg, hanged for crimes that shocked the conscience of the world. Others took their own lives in bunkers and burning forests as everything they had built collapsed around them. A few rotted away in Soviet prison camps, forgotten by everyone except the guards who watched them slowly waste away. And some, perhaps most disturbing of all, lived long, comfortable lives and died peacefully in their beds, never spending a single day answering for what they had done or what they had allowed to happen. This is the complete accounting of how Hitler's 26 field marshals met their end. The suicides, the executions, the mysterious deaths, the ones who got away. And the pattern that emerges from these 26 fates reveals something profoundly unsettling about justice, loyalty, and the price of looking the other way when evil unfolds before your eyes. What you're about to hear is not a glorification of these men. It's a reckoning, a final ledger of how power, complicity, and moral cowardice ultimately come due. Some of these deaths will shock you, others will anger you, and a few will leave you wondering whether justice was ever truly served at all. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how these 26 men died, you first need to understand what they represented. The rank of Field Marshal in Germany carried a weight that stretched back centuries. It was a title that Frederick the Great had made legendary, that Bismarck's wars had sanctified, that the great commanders of the First World War like Hindenburg and Ludendorff had embodied. To become a German field marshal meant entering an aristocracy of command, a brotherhood of military genius that supposedly made you immortal in the annals of history. Hitler understood this mystique better than anyone. He used the golden baton as a tool of control, dangling it before his generals like a prize that could never be taken away. Perform brilliantly in battle, and you would join the pantheon of German military greatness. Fail him, and you would be discarded without a second thought. What none of these men fully understood at the beginning was that Hitler wasn't building a traditional military elite bound by centuries of honor and professional tradition. He was building something entirely new, a personal instrument of ideological conquest where loyalty to him mattered more than tactical brilliance, more than honor, more than the laws of war themselves. And once that instrument was broken, once Germany lay in ruins, these men discovered that their golden batons offered them no protection whatsoever. The very first man to learn this brutal lesson was Werner von Blomberg. In 1936, Blomberg became the first officer Hitler promoted to field marshal in the Nazi era. He was the Minister of War, the man who had secretly rearmed Germany in violation of the Versailles Treaty and prepared the nation for the wars of expansion that everyone knew were coming. Blomberg believed in Hitler with the intensity of a religious convert. He saw the Führer as Germany's salvation after the humiliations and economic devastation that had followed the First World War. That faith made him completely blind to the dangers that were already gathering around him like wolves in the darkness. In January 1938, Blomberg married a woman named Margarethe Grahn. He was 60 years old and believed he had found happiness for the first time in years. Hitler himself attended the wedding as a witness. It seemed like a fairy tale ending for a dedicated public servant. But within days, police files surfaced showing that Blomberg's new bride had a past that no officer's wife could survive in the rigid, judgmental world of the German military establishment. There were photographs, a criminal record, associations that would destroy any man's career. The scandal was almost certainly engineered by Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, two powerful Nazi leaders who wanted Blomberg removed from his position so they could expand their own influence. Hitler, faced with this embarrassment, allowed it to happen. Blomberg was forced to resign in complete disgrace and spent the rest of the war years exiled in Bavaria, forgotten and humiliated while the conflicts he had helped prepare unfolded without him. When the Allies arrived in 1945, they arrested him as a potential war criminal. But there would be no trial. Werner von Blomberg died in American custody in Nuremberg on March 14, 1946, a broken man whose heart simply gave out. The first field marshal of the Nazi era never commanded troops in battle under Hitler. He was destroyed by political intrigue before the shooting even started, and that set a dark precedent for everything that followed. With Blomberg gone, Hitler needed a new commander-in-chief for the German army. He chose Walther von Brauchitsch, a career officer with an aristocratic bearing and a reputation for agreeing with whoever held power at any given moment. Brauchitsch looked the part of a Prussian general, tall, dignified, always impeccably uniformed. But beneath that polished exterior was a man who fundamentally lacked the moral courage to stand up to Hitler when it truly mattered. Brauchitsch was promoted to Field Marshal after the stunning victory over France in July 1940, when German arms seemed absolutely invincible and the future appeared to belong entirely to the Wehrmacht. But Brauchitsch was not a true believer in National Socialism. He was simply a man who followed orders because that was what German officers had always done for generations. It was their tradition, their code, their identity. When Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, began to stall in the frozen mud outside Moscow in the terrible winter of 1941, Hitler needed someone to blame for the failure of his grand strategy. Brauchitsch became that convenient scapegoat. On December 19, 1941, Hitler dismissed him in a fury and took personal command of the German army himself, a fateful decision that would shape every disaster that followed for the remainder of the war. Brauchitsch retreated into private life, suffering from chronic heart disease and carrying the crushing knowledge that his years of obedience and accommodation had enabled catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. He was arrested by the British after the war and held for trial as a war criminal. But justice never came for Walther von Brauchitsch. He died in British custody in Hamburg on October 18, 1948, still awaiting a trial that would never take place. He had commanded the German army during the invasions of Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Millions of people had died under orders that bore his signature. And in the end, he simply faded away, a bureaucrat in uniform whose heart gave out before any court could render its judgment. But not all of Hitler's field marshals would escape so quietly into death. Some would face the hangman's noose, and the most infamous execution of them all belonged to Wilhelm Keitel. But before we follow that dark thread to its conclusion, there is one name that must be entered into this ledger, a man who received the baton as an honorary gesture rather than an actual military command. Archduke Eugen von Österreich-Teschen was an Austro-Hungarian relic, a field marshal from the old Habsburg Empire who had commanded armies during the First World War decades earlier. On October 31, 1940, Hitler granted him an honorary promotion to German Field Marshal as a symbolic gesture of respect to the aging warrior and as a way of unifying German and Austrian military traditions under the swastika. Archduke Eugen was 84 years old and had been retired for decades. He never commanded a single German soldier in the Second World War. He died peacefully in his bed in Vienna on December 9, 1941, while the Wehrmacht was still advancing on all fronts and victory still seemed possible. His was perhaps the gentlest fate of any man to hold the rank, a ceremonial honor followed by a quiet natural death, completely untouched by the catastrophes that would consume his fellow field marshals in the years to come. Now we return to Wilhelm Keitel, the man who would face the hangman at Nuremberg. Keitel was not a warrior in any meaningful sense of that word. He was an administrator, a manager of violence, a man who specialized in translating Hitler's volcanic rages and impossible demands into precise military directives that could be executed by the officers beneath him. As chief of the High Command of the Armed Forces, the OKW, Keitel sat at Hitler's right hand throughout the entire war. He was present at every major strategic conference, every critical decision, every turning point, and he signed documents that made him personally complicit in mass murder on a continental scale. The Commissar Order, which mandated the immediate execution of any captured Soviet political officers without trial. The Night and Fog Decree, which caused thousands of resistance fighters across occupied Europe to simply vanish into concentration camps, never to be seen again. Directives that transformed the Wehrmacht from a professional fighting force into an active instrument of genocidal warfare. Other German generals despised Keitel. Behind his back, they called him Lackeytel, a contemptuous pun combining his name with the German word Lakai, meaning lackey or servile follower. Keitel never objected to this characterization. He never resigned in protest over any order, no matter how criminal. He never pushed back against even the most obviously illegal commands. He simply nodded, clicked his heels together, saluted, and signed whatever document was placed before him. When Berlin fell in May 1945 and Germany's unconditional surrender became inevitable, it was Wilhelm Keitel who signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the German armed forces, the final signature on the death certificate of the Third Reich. And when the International Military Tribunal convened at Nuremberg to try the major war criminals, Keitel sat in the defendant's dock, his face gray with exhaustion and defeat, his excuses hollow and utterly unconvincing to anyone who heard them. He claimed he was merely a soldier following orders from his lawful commander-in-chief. He claimed he had no authority to refuse. He claimed he bore no personal responsibility for the consequences of documents he had signed. The tribunal did not agree with any of these arguments. On October 1st, 1946, Wilhelm Keitel was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. 16 days later, on October 16th, he was led to the gallows that had been erected in the gymnasium of Nuremberg prison. His last words, witnessed by guards and reporters, were these: "I call on God Almighty to have mercy on the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers have fallen for the fatherland. I follow now my sons. All for Germany." Then the trapdoor opened beneath his feet. But Keitel did not die quickly. The drop was not calculated correctly. The rope did not snap his neck as it was designed to do. Instead, Wilhelm Keitel strangled slowly, his body convulsing for 13 agonizing minutes before he finally went still. It was a brutal, ugly end for a man who had once commanded the respect of armies. Some historians call it justice. Others call it revenge. But no one could deny that Keitel had earned his place on those gallows through years of willing complicity. Keitel was not the only field marshal to face execution, but the next man to hang died for very different reasons. Erwin von Witzleben was the complete opposite of Keitel in almost every way that mattered. Witzleben was an old-school Prussian officer who had come to despise the Nazi regime almost from the moment Hitler took power. He had been a career soldier since before the First World War, raised in the traditions of the German officer corps, taught that honor and duty mattered more than political ideology. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal after the French campaign in 1940, recognizing his undeniable skill as a field commander. But by 1942, Witzleben's health problems had forced him into retirement, and during those years away from active duty, his hatred for the Nazi regime only intensified with each passing month. When the conspiracy to assassinate Hitler began to crystallize around a young officer named Klaus von Stauffenberg in 1944, Witzleben was brought into the plot despite his poor health. If Stauffenberg's bomb succeeded in killing Hitler, Witzleben would become the new commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht and would help oversee the military takeover of the government and negotiations for peace with the Western Allies. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg placed his briefcase containing the bomb under the conference table at Hitler's headquarters in East Prussia and then left the room. The bomb exploded exactly as planned, shattering the building and killing several officers who were standing near the table. But Adolf Hitler survived with only minor injuries. Within hours, the entire conspiracy collapsed as the Gestapo began making arrests all across Germany. Witzleben was seized almost immediately, along with dozens of other conspirators. The trial that followed was not about justice. It was a spectacle of calculated humiliation designed to send a message to anyone else who might consider defying the Führer. The Nazis stripped Witzleben of his uniform and medals and forced him to appear in the People's Court wearing ill-fitting civilian clothes without even a belt. So he had to hold up his trousers with one hand while the notorious Nazi judge Roland Freisler screamed insults and abuse at him for hours. Witzleben remained defiant until the very end, refusing to beg for mercy or renounce his actions. On August 8, 1944, he was taken to Plötzensee prison in Berlin and hanged with piano wire from a meat hook, a deliberately slow and agonizing method of execution. Hitler ordered the entire execution to be filmed for his personal viewing pleasure. Erwin von Witzleben died slowly and in terrible pain, but he died standing for what he believed was right. He remains the only German field marshal ever executed by his own government for the crime of treason. His courage cost him absolutely everything, but unlike Keitel, he died on his feet rather than on his knees. The July 20th conspiracy claimed more victims than just Witzleben. Its tentacles reached deep into the highest levels of the German officer corps, and it touched the career of the most famous German military commander of the entire war. Erwin Rommel needed no introduction even in 1944. The Desert Fox had become a living legend during the North African campaign, a commander whose tactical brilliance and personal charisma had humiliated the British Army repeatedly and earned the grudging respect even of his enemies. Winston Churchill himself had praised Rommel in the British House of Commons, a remarkable tribute to pay to an adversary. Hitler had promoted Rommel to Field Marshal in June 1942, making him the youngest German officer ever to hold that exalted rank. Rommel seemed to embody everything the Nazi propaganda machine wanted in a military hero: dashing, aggressive, consistently victorious, and apparently completely loyal to the Führer. But by 1944, Rommel was a profoundly changed man. He had seen the war from the inside. He had witnessed the hopelessness of Germany's strategic situation. He had come to understand the inevitability of Allied victory. And most importantly, he had come to believe that Adolf Hitler had to be removed from power if Germany was to be saved from total annihilation. Rommel's exact involvement in the July 20th plot remains a subject of historical debate even today. He may not have known specifically about Stauffenberg's bomb. He may have preferred to arrest Hitler and put him on trial rather than assassinate him outright. But he certainly knew about the conspiracy, and he did absolutely nothing to report it to the authorities or to stop it from proceeding. That passive complicity was more than enough to seal his fate. When the plot failed and the Gestapo began systematically unraveling the network of conspirators through interrogations and torture, Rommel's name surfaced repeatedly in confessions that were extracted under unbearable pressure. Hitler faced an impossible dilemma. He could not put Erwin Rommel on public trial. Rommel was far too popular with the German people, far too beloved by ordinary soldiers, far too valuable as a propaganda symbol of German military excellence. A public execution would be an absolute disaster that might shake the population's faith in the regime itself at the worst possible moment. So Hitler offered Rommel a devil's bargain through intermediaries. Take poison, and your death will be announced to the public as the result of injuries you suffered during an Allied air attack. You will receive a full state funeral with military honors. Your wife and son will be protected from any reprisals. Your family will receive your full pension. But if you refuse this offer, you will be arrested immediately, tried before the People's Court, inevitably convicted, and executed as a traitor to Germany. And under the Nazi policy of Sippenhaft, collective punishment for the crimes of family members, your wife and son will also be arrested and likely sent to concentration camps. On October 14, 1944, two generals arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen carrying Hitler's ultimatum. Rommel said goodbye to his wife Lucy and his teenage son Manfred, walked calmly to the waiting staff car, and climbed into the back seat. 5 minutes later, he bit down on the cyanide capsule the generals had brought and died within minutes. The Nazi regime gave Erwin Rommel a hero's funeral with all the pageantry and propaganda they could muster. Adolf Hitler even sent a massive funeral wreath. The truth about how Rommel actually died did not emerge until after the war ended and his family could finally speak freely. His death is often described as suicide, but that word doesn't capture the full reality of what happened. It was murder by ultimatum, a field marshal destroyed by the very regime he had served with such distinction and loyalty for so many years. Rommel was far from alone in choosing death over capture or trial. As the war turned irrevocably against Germany throughout 1944 and 1945, suicide became almost an epidemic among the senior leadership, and few deaths illustrated the complete collapse of the Reich more starkly than that of Günther von Kluge. Kluge was an experienced and capable commander who had led German armies with considerable success in France and across the vast killing fields of the Eastern Front. Hitler had promoted him to Field Marshal in July 1940, recognizing his abilities during the victorious campaign against France. For years, Kluge served with apparent loyalty even as his private doubts about Hitler's leadership grew increasingly severe. He had been approached multiple times by members of the resistance movement, but he never fully committed himself to their cause. He was a fence-sitter who could never quite decide which side of history he wanted to be on when the final reckoning came. By the summer of 1944, Kluge was commanding all German forces in the West, desperately trying to contain the Allied breakout from the Normandy beachhead following D-Day. He failed completely. The entire front collapsed under the overwhelming weight of Allied material superiority, tactical air power, and the sheer exhaustion of German forces that had been fighting without adequate rest or reinforcement for weeks. And then Hitler began receiving reports, possibly accurate, possibly completely fabricated by rivals, that Kluge had attempted to make contact with Allied commanders about negotiating a separate peace agreement. Whether these reports were actually true hardly mattered at all. In the paranoid atmosphere following the July 20th assassination attempt, the mere accusation was absolutely fatal. On August 17, 1944, Hitler abruptly dismissed Kluge from all command and ordered him to return to Berlin immediately for questioning. Kluge understood exactly what that summons meant. He had seen what happened to other officers who had fallen from Hitler's favor. He knew about the trials, the torture, the executions. Somewhere on the long road between the collapsing front lines and the German capital, Günther von Kluge pulled out a cyanide capsule that he had been carrying with him and swallowed it. His body was found in his staff car near the city of Metz. He left behind a letter addressed to Adolf Hitler, a strange and deeply conflicted document that mixed continued expressions of personal loyalty with complete despair over Germany's absolutely hopeless military situation. The Golden Baton had not saved him from anything. Nothing could have. Kluge's lonely death on that French road was not unique. Less than a year later, another field marshal would follow his example under even more dramatic and desperate circumstances. Walther Model was known throughout the German military as Hitler's ultimate troubleshooter, the general who was repeatedly sent to stabilize fronts that were actively collapsing into complete chaos. He earned the nickname the Führer's Fireman because he was dispatched again and again to military crises where other commanders had already failed spectacularly. Model had somehow held army groups centered together after the catastrophic Soviet summer offensive called Operation Bagration destroyed it in the summer of 1944, preventing a total collapse and retreat. He had commanded Army Group B during the Ardennes Offensive, the desperate gamble known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, fighting to extract something meaningful from Hitler's last major offensive in the West. Model was fierce, aggressive, fanatical in his devotion to duty, and utterly committed to resistance until the absolute end. He was not particularly a Nazi ideologue, but he believed deeply in Germany and in the soldiers' sacred obligation to fight regardless of the odds. By April 1945, however, even Model's legendary determination and tactical skill had reached their absolute limits. His Army Group B was completely encircled in the Ruhr industrial region by overwhelming American forces in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. More than 300,000 German soldiers were trapped with no possibility of relief, no hope of breakout, and dwindling supplies of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Model absolutely refused to surrender. Instead, he took an extraordinary step. He formally disbanded Army Group B and released all of his soldiers from their oath of military allegiance, so they could surrender individually to the Americans without the dishonor of having their commander capitulate. Then, on April 21, 1945, Walther Model walked alone into a small forest near the town of Duisburg. He drew his service pistol, placed it against his temple, and pulled the trigger. His body was discovered several days later by German civilians, still wearing his field marshal's uniform. Model had once told members of his staff that a German field marshal does not become a prisoner of war. It was a matter of honor, of tradition, of identity. He kept that vow in the only way that remained available to him. His suicide became symbolic of the complete collapse of the Wehrmacht's fighting spirit in the war's final weeks. But the wave of suicides was not confined to forests and country roads as the Reich collapsed. They continued in the burning ruins of Berlin itself, even as Soviet artillery shells fell directly on the heart of the German government. Robert Ritter von Greim holds the extraordinary and bizarre distinction of being the very last man Adolf Hitler ever promoted to Field Marshal, and his story is one of the strangest and most surreal episodes of the war's final apocalyptic days. Greim was a Luftwaffe general, a decorated fighter ace from the First World War who had remained fanatically and personally loyal to Hitler even when other commanders began to waver or quietly distance themselves. In late April 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery from all directions and artillery shells shook the underground bunker where Hitler had taken his final refuge, the Führer summoned Greim to Berlin for a meeting. Flying into a city that was actively under siege was effectively a suicide mission. The skies above Berlin were filled with Soviet fighter aircraft hunting for targets. The streets were active battlegrounds where German soldiers fought Soviet infantry in brutal house-to-house combat. But Greim came anyway, demonstrating his loyalty one final time. He was piloted by the equally fanatical aviator Hanna Reich in a small Fiesler Storch aircraft. Their plane was hit multiple times by Soviet anti-aircraft fire during the approach to the city. Greim was seriously wounded in the leg by shell fragments. They crash-landed near the Brandenburg Gate and made their way on foot through the rubble, smoke, and constant gunfire to reach Hitler's bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. There, in the flickering candlelight of Germany's last redoubt, surrounded by the sounds of Soviet shells impacting overhead, Adolf Hitler promoted Greim to the rank of Field Marshal and formally named him Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, replacing Hermann Göring, who had just been stripped of all ranks and offices for alleged treason. It was a completely meaningless appointment. The Luftwaffe barely existed anymore as an organized fighting force. Fuel supplies were exhausted. Aircraft had been destroyed on the ground or shot down. Experienced pilots were dead, captured, or had deserted. There was literally nothing left to command. But Greim accepted his impossible assignment with the same fanatical devotion he had always shown. He and Reich managed to escape from Berlin in another harrowing flight, and Greim surrendered to American forces several days later. He was taken to a military hospital in Salzburg, Austria, to receive treatment for his infected leg wound. On May 24, 1945, less than 1 month after receiving his promotion to Field Marshal, Robert Ritter von Greim bit down on a cyanide capsule he had concealed and died within minutes. He was the last officer to receive Hitler's Golden Baton. He had carried that rank for less than 4 weeks. The symbolism of his death captured everything about the final days of the Third Reich. Loyalty, delusion, and self-destruction all wrapped together in a single tragic figure. But Greim was not the most famous Luftwaffe commander to die by his own hand. That grim and historically significant distinction belongs to Hermann Göring himself, the only man in the entire Third Reich to hold a rank that was actually higher than Field Marshal. Reich Marshal of the Greater German Reich, a rank created specifically for him by Hitler. Göring had been at Hitler's side since the very earliest days of the Nazi movement in the 1920s. He had been officially designated as Hitler's successor, the number 2 man in the entire Reich. As head of the Luftwaffe, he had promised Hitler and the German people that he would destroy the Royal Air Force and bomb Britain into submission and surrender. As director of the 4-year plan, he had controlled the German economy and directed it entirely toward preparation for war. As Reich Marshal, he had accumulated power, wealth, and political influence that made him second only to Adolf Hitler himself in the Nazi hierarchy. But Göring was also grotesquely corrupt, openly and shamelessly stealing artwork and valuables from conquered nations for his personal collection. He was addicted to morphine, a dependency that dated back to injuries he had suffered during the failed beer hall putsch in 1923. He was increasingly detached from military and political reality as the war dragged on and Germany's situation deteriorated. And he was growing ever more bloated, ineffective, and ridiculed behind his back by other Nazi leaders who saw him as a buffoon in an elaborate uniform. By April 1945, Göring correctly sensed that Hitler was finished, that the Führer was trapped in Berlin with no possibility of escape. When Göring sent a telegram from his refuge in Bavaria suggesting that perhaps he should assume leadership of the Reich if Hitler could not escape from the city, the Führer exploded in one final rage. Hitler ordered Göring immediately stripped of all offices, all ranks, and all honors. He expelled him from the Nazi Party and placed him under arrest for high treason. It was the abrupt and bitter end of a partnership that had lasted more than 2 decades. Göring surrendered to American forces in May 1945, apparently expecting to be treated as a head of state or perhaps even as a potential negotiating partner for post-war political arrangements. Instead, he found himself sitting in the defendant's dock at Nuremberg, on trial alongside the other surviving Nazi leaders for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence presented against Göring was absolutely overwhelming and damning. He was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by hanging. But on the night of October 15, 1946, just a few hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring bit down on a cyanide capsule that had somehow been hidden in his prison cell throughout the entire months-long trial and his imprisonment. He died with something resembling a smirk on his face, cheating the hangman by mere minutes and denying the Allies their most prominent execution. To this day, no one knows with absolute certainty how Göring obtained the poison or managed to keep it hidden from his guards through multiple searches and transfers. The Reich Marshal's final act was one last escape, one last gesture of contempt and defiance toward the justice system that had finally caught up with him after years of impunity. The suicides and the executions tell one particular kind of story about how these field marshals met their ends. But many of Hitler's senior commanders actually survived the war itself, only to face a slower, more ambiguous, and often deeply unsatisfying reckoning in the years that followed. And some of those stories are stranger and more disturbing than any battlefield death could ever be. Friedrich Paulus was the commander who led the German Sixth Army all the way to Stalingrad in the summer and fall of 1942. His forces had driven hundreds of miles deep into Soviet territory, reaching the banks of the Volga River and fighting their way through the ruins of the city that bore Joseph Stalin's name in brutal house-to-house combat. Then the Soviet trap closed with devastating effectiveness. In November 1942, Soviet forces launched Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that encircled Paulus and nearly 300,000 German soldiers in a shrinking pocket of frozen rubble and destroyed buildings. Hitler absolutely refused to authorize any attempt at a breakout. He ordered Paulus to hold his position at all costs, promising that supplies would be delivered by air, a promise that was never fulfilled in anything close to sufficient quantities. For months through the terrible Russian winter, the Sixth Army slowly starved and froze to death, while Soviet forces methodically tightened the noose around them. In January 1943, as the military situation became utterly and completely hopeless, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal. It was a deliberate and cynical signal rather than any kind of genuine honor. No German field marshal in history had ever surrendered to an enemy force. Hitler fully expected and intended that Paulus would take his own life rather than accept the humiliation of capture. Friedrich Paulus did not oblige him. On January 31, 1943, Paulus formally surrendered to Soviet forces, becoming the first German field marshal in the entire history of Prussia and Germany to be taken prisoner by an enemy. Adolf Hitler was absolutely apoplectic with rage when he learned of the surrender, calling Paulus a coward and a traitor who had destroyed his own honor and the honor of the German officer corps. Paulus spent the remainder of the war in Soviet captivity, and during those years, he underwent a remarkable and controversial transformation. He eventually agreed to sign propaganda statements publicly denouncing the Nazi regime and calling on German soldiers still fighting to lay down their arms and surrender. He testified for the Soviet prosecution at the Nuremberg trials against his former comrades. After the war officially ended, Paulus was eventually released from captivity, and he made the extraordinary choice to live in East Germany, behind the Iron Curtain, rather than return to West Germany, where most other surviving officers had settled. He became a ghost, a man haunted by the catastrophe he had presided over at Stalingrad, where hundreds of thousands of men under his command had died or been captured. Friedrich Paulus died in Dresden on February 1, 1957, largely forgotten by history and remembered primarily as a cautionary tale about the terrible consequences of obedience taken far beyond all reasonable limits. Paulus was not the only field marshal to die in Soviet hands, though his end was comparatively gentle compared to the fates that awaited several others who fell into Stalin's custody. Ewald von Kleist was a brilliant armored commander, one of the true architects and pioneers of German mechanized warfare. He had led the armored spearhead that pierced through the Ardennes forest in 1940, shattering the French defensive lines and enabling the conquest of France. He had commanded the dramatic drive toward the Caucasus oil fields in 1942, pushing German forces deeper into Soviet territory than any other general managed to achieve. Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal in February 1943 in recognition of his tactical abilities. But Kleist made the fatal mistake of criticizing Nazi policies toward civilian populations in occupied territories, an unusual and dangerous moral stance for any German senior commander to take publicly. He was abruptly dismissed from all commands in March 1944 and spent the remainder of the war in forced retirement. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Kleist made the decision to surrender to American forces rather than Soviet forces, hoping desperately for fair treatment from the Western Allies. That hope was tragically misplaced. The Americans, under pressure from their Soviet allies and pursuant to agreements made at Yalta, transferred Kleist to Yugoslav custody to face war crimes charges for actions that had taken place in the Balkans. Yugoslavia, in turn, handed him directly over to the Soviet Union. Kleist was subjected to a show trial by a Soviet military tribunal and sentenced to decades of imprisonment in the Gulag system. Ewald von Kleist died in Vladimir prison, deep inside the Soviet Union, in November 1954. He was 73 years old and had not seen freedom or his family for nearly a decade. His crime, in the end, was simply being a German field marshal at a historical moment when the Soviets wanted trophies and symbols of victory more than they wanted any semblance of actual justice. But the majority of surviving field marshals eventually found their way into Western occupation zones, where the process of reckoning took very different forms and often resulted in outcomes that were far more lenient and deeply controversial. Gerd von Rundstedt was the elder statesman of the entire German officer corps, a living relic of an earlier era whose military career stretched all the way back to service in the Kaiser's army before the First World War even began. He had commanded Army Group South during the invasion of Poland, Army Group A during the lightning conquest of France, and Army Group South again during the initial catastrophic advance deep into Soviet territory. Hitler had dismissed him and then recalled him to duty multiple times throughout the war in a constant cycle of exile and reluctant reinstatement whenever the military situation became particularly desperate. By 1945, Rundstedt was physically exhausted, seriously ill with chronic heart problems, and thoroughly disillusioned with absolutely everything the war had become and represented. He surrendered to American forces and was held initially as a prisoner of war. The British government seriously considered putting him on trial for war crimes, particularly for his role in implementing harsh occupation policies and anti-partisan measures. But Rundstedt's rapidly failing health and advanced age made any prosecution seem impractical and potentially pointless. He was quietly released from custody in 1949 and spent his final years living in Hanover, occasionally granting interviews to historians and journalists, and maintaining until the very end that he had merely been a professional soldier performing his sworn duty to his country. Gerd von Rundstedt died on February 24, 1953, at the age of 77, never having faced any war crimes tribunal. His historical reputation remains deeply contested and unresolved to this day. Was he fundamentally a decent man who found himself trapped in an impossible situation beyond his control? Or was he simply another willing enabler of atrocity who managed to escape meaningful accountability through nothing more than biological luck and favorable timing? History has never rendered any kind of final or satisfying verdict on that question. Fedor von Bock was the field marshal who came closer than anyone else to capturing Moscow during the terrible winter offensive of 1941 before the Soviet counteroffensive hurled his forces back from the capital with devastating losses. Hitler dismissed him from command in July 1942 after yet another strategic disagreement, and Bock never held another significant military position for the remainder of the war. He spent the final years of the conflict in bitter, resentful retirement, watching from the sidelines as the Reich he had served for decades collapsed in flames around him. On May 3, 1945, just 5 days before Germany's final unconditional surrender, Bock was traveling by automobile near the town of Lenzon in northern Germany. According to the official account, A British Royal Air Force fighter aircraft spotted the vehicle on the road and attacked it with machine gun fire. Bach's wife, his stepdaughter, and a family friend were all killed instantly in the attack. Bach himself was severely wounded by the strafing. He died the following day, May 4, 1945, from his injuries. Fedor von Bock had survived every major battle of the Eastern Front, every crisis of command, every political intrigue and power struggle, only to die from what appeared to be a completely random attack on a country road during the war's final chaotic hours. The violence that had consumed Europe for 6 years found him anyway, even when he must have believed himself finally safe. But some historians have questioned whether the official account of Bach's death is actually accurate. There are suggestions, never fully proven, that he may have been killed by retreating German soldiers who blamed him for military disasters and defeats. The truth about his final moments may never be known with certainty. Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb commanded Army Group North during the German invasion of the Soviet Union and bore direct responsibility for the early stages of the 900-day siege of Leningrad, one of the longest and deadliest sieges in all of human history. He clashed repeatedly with Adolf Hitler over military strategy and the proper conduct of military operations, and was abruptly dismissed from all commands in January 1942. After the war ended, Lieb was put on trial at Nuremberg during what became known as the High Command Trial, which prosecuted senior German military officers for war crimes. He was convicted of transmitting and implementing criminal orders to forces under his command, but he was sentenced only to time already served in custody. He was released immediately after his conviction and spent the rest of his life quietly in Bavaria, dying on April 29, 1956. Lieb had been one of the very few German field marshals to actually express written criticism of Nazi atrocities while the war was still ongoing, raising objections through official channels about the treatment of Soviet prisoners and civilians. Yet his protests never extended to resignation from his position or any form of active resistance to the regime. That fundamental moral ambiguity defined his entire legacy and left historians unable to render any clear judgment about his character or his culpability. The pattern of deeply compromised and unsatisfying justice repeated itself again and again throughout the post-war period, as field marshal after field marshal managed to avoid the full legal and moral consequences of their service to the Third Reich. Ernst Busch had commanded Army Group Center when it was catastrophically destroyed by the massive Soviet summer offensive known as Operation Bagration in June and July 1944, the worst single defeat in German military history. Hitler blamed Busch personally for the disaster and dismissed him immediately in complete disgrace. Busch was captured by British forces at the end of the war and held as a prisoner. He died while still in British custody on July 17, 1945, just weeks after Germany's surrender. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. He was 60 years old. Whether the immense stress and shame of military defeat directly contributed to his death, no one can say with any certainty. Wilhelm List commanded Army Group A during the drive toward the Caucasus oil fields in 1942, before being dismissed by Hitler for moving too cautiously and failing to achieve his assigned objectives quickly enough. After the war, he was tried at Nuremberg in what became known as the hostages trial for ordering brutal reprisals against civilian populations in the Balkans during his earlier service in that theater of operations. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, but he was quietly released in 1952 due to deteriorating health and spent the rest of his remarkably long life in comfortable obscurity in West Germany. Wilhelm List died in 1971 at the age of 91. One of the longest-lived of all the German field marshals, a man who had largely escaped the full weight of historical judgment through the simple biological fortune of outlasting his prosecutors and the fading of public memory. George von Kuckeler succeeded Lieb in command of Army Group North and therefore bore direct command responsibility for the continuation of the Leningrad blockade. 900 days of deliberate siege warfare killed approximately 1 million Soviet civilians through starvation, disease, and constant bombardment, making it one of the single deadliest events in the entire history of human warfare. After the war ended, Kuckeler was tried for war crimes, convicted, and sentenced to 20 years of imprisonment. He was released early in 1953 after serving only a fraction of his sentence, and died in 1968. His central role in the Leningrad atrocity earned him a conviction in court, but his actual sentence proved far lighter than the magnitude of the crime would seem to warrant. The scales of post-war justice proved maddeningly inconsistent in their application from case to case. Maximilian von Weizsäcker commanded German forces in the Balkans and on the Eastern Front, overseeing military operations during some of the most brutal and criminal campaigns of the entire war. He was formally indicted for war crimes after Germany's surrender, but he was never actually brought to trial. The legal proceedings were discontinued and eventually abandoned entirely because of his deteriorating health and advanced age. Maximilian von Weizsäcker died in 1954, yet another field marshal who managed to slip through the cracks of post-war accountability and avoid any courtroom reckoning for his actions. Walther von Reichenau was fundamentally different from most of his fellow field marshals in one crucial respect. He was a genuine, true believer in National Socialist ideology, one of the very few senior Wehrmacht commanders who embraced Nazi racial theories and political goals with authentic enthusiasm rather than mere professional accommodation. He commanded the 6th Army during the invasion of the Soviet Union and personally issued orders explicitly calling for the systematic annihilation of Soviet political commissars, Communist Party officials, and Jewish civilians behind the advancing front lines. His brutal written directives helped establish the tone and framework for the entire war of racial extermination in the East. But Walther von Reichenau never faced any kind of justice for his crimes. In January 1942, while still in active command of his forces, he suffered a massive and debilitating stroke. He was being evacuated by air back to Germany for emergency medical treatment when his transport aircraft crashed on landing. Reichenau died on January 17, 1942, either from complications of the stroke itself or from injuries sustained in the crash. The exact medical cause of death has never been determined with complete certainty. He was one of the very few German field marshals to die during the actual course of the war itself, and history never had any opportunity to render its verdict on him in any formal court of law. The Luftwaffe produced its own field marshals, and their individual fates varied just as widely as those of their army counterparts. Albert Kesselring, known universally as Smiling Albert for his perpetually optimistic demeanor and unfailingly good humor even in desperate situations, was one of the most genuinely capable German commanders of the entire war. He conducted the defense of Italy from 1943 to 1945 with such extraordinary skill and tactical brilliance that the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula became a grinding war of attrition lasting nearly 2 full years. But Kesselring was also directly complicit in serious atrocities. He was tried and convicted by a British military tribunal specifically for the Ardeatine massacre in Rome, where 335 Italian civilians were deliberately murdered in collective reprisal for a partisan attack that had killed German soldiers, and for other documented war crimes committed by forces under his command. He was initially sentenced to death, but that sentence was subsequently commuted to life imprisonment. Then he was released in 1952, supposedly due to failing health, though he lived for another 8 years after his release. He spent those final years writing his memoirs and giving interviews that consistently defended his wartime record and decisions. Albert Kesselring died on July 16, 1960. Like so many of his fellow field marshals, he was never fully called to account in any meaningful way for his actions. Hugo Sperl commanded Luftwaffe forces during the bombing campaigns against Warsaw, Rotterdam, and London, making him one of the primary architects of German aerial terror bombing against civilian populations. Yet he was actually acquitted at Nuremberg for lack of sufficient direct evidence tying him personally to specific war crimes that could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. He died in relative obscurity in Munich on April 2, 1953, his role in the deaths of thousands of civilians never formally adjudicated. Erhard Milch was deeply involved in both Luftwaffe combat operations and in the systematic exploitation of slave labor in German aircraft production facilities, where tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were literally worked to death manufacturing weapons. He was convicted at Nuremberg and sentenced to life imprisonment, only to be quietly released in 1954 after serving less than a decade. He spent the rest of his remarkably long life working as an aviation consultant, successfully rehabilitating his public reputation to a degree that seems almost incomprehensible today. Erhard Milch died in 1972, having outlived most of his fellow field marshals and having escaped any lasting consequences for his crimes. Wolfram von Richthofen was the younger cousin of Manfred von Richthofen, the legendary Red Baron fighter ace of the First World War, and he became one of the most tactically effective Luftwaffe commanders of the Second World War. He personally pioneered and perfected the close air support techniques that were used so devastatingly against civilian targets at Guernica in Spain, Warsaw in Poland, and across countless battlefields of the Eastern Front. But by 1944, Richthofen's health was rapidly failing. He was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor and forced to retire from all active military duties. Wolfram von Richthofen died on July 12, 1945, just weeks after Germany's final surrender, killed slowly by the disease that had been growing inside his skull while he waged total war across half of Europe. He never faced any trial or formal accounting for his role in the development of terror bombing as a systematic military tactic. The very last surviving German field marshals of the Second World War lived long enough to witness their country's complete reconstruction from total devastation, the division of Germany into East and West, the Cold War, and the economic miracle that transformed West Germany into a prosperous democracy. Some of them attempted to rehabilitate their personal and professional reputations through carefully crafted memoirs and selective interviews with sympathetic historians. None of them succeeded entirely in escaping the shadow of what they had done and what they had enabled. Erich von Manstein is still widely regarded by military historians and strategists as perhaps the single most brilliant German operational commander of the entire war. His strategic plan for the invasion of France, the famous sickle cut through the Ardennes forest, was an absolute masterpiece of creative military thinking that caught the French and British completely by surprise. His defensive operations on the Eastern Front throughout 1943 and 1944 demonstrated tactical and operational brilliance under absolutely impossible strategic conditions. But Erich von Manstein also commanded forces in areas where the SS Einsatzgruppen death squads conducted systematic mass murder of Jewish civilians and other targeted populations. He knew exactly what was happening behind his front lines. He had the authority to intervene or at minimum to protest through official channels. He did neither. After the war ended, Manstein was tried by a British military tribunal and convicted of neglecting his legal duty to protect civilian lives and territories under his military control and of transmitting and implementing criminal orders. He served less than 4 years of his sentence before being released due to health concerns and political considerations related to West German rearmament. He then spent the next 2 decades serving as an advisor to the newly created West German Bundeswehr and writing influential memoirs that presented himself as a pure military professional, a strategic genius completely untouched by Nazi ideology or political considerations. Erich von Manstein died on June 9, 1973, at the age of 85. His military reputation remains a fiercely contested battlefield among historians. Was he truly a military genius who found himself serving a criminal regime? Or was he a willing participant in atrocity who successfully manipulated his image for post-war consumption? That question has never been resolved to anyone's complete satisfaction. Ferdinand Schorner holds the distinction of being Adolf Hitler's very last field marshal, promoted in the final days of April 1945 as the Thousand-Year Reich literally crumbled into dust around them. Schorner was absolutely fanatical, extraordinarily brutal even by the standards of the German military, and genuinely feared by his own soldiers almost as much as they feared the enemy. He routinely ordered the immediate execution of his own men for cowardice, desertion, defeatism, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. When the final end came in May 1945, Schorner attempted to flee westward to escape Soviet captivity, but he was captured by American forces and eventually handed over to the Soviet Union as part of prisoner exchange agreements. He spent a full decade in Soviet labor camps before finally being returned to West Germany in 1955. There, German civilian authorities actually tried and convicted him for the numerous illegal executions of German soldiers he had ordered during the war's chaotic final days. He served 4 years in a German prison and was then released. Ferdinand Schorner died in 1973, utterly unrepentant to his last breath, still insisting that he had only done what was absolutely necessary to maintain military discipline and order. And so the final ledger of the 26 field marshals closes at last. 26 men who received the Golden Baton from Adolf Hitler over the course of the Third Reich's 12-year existence. Some died by their own hand, swallowing cyanide capsules in underground bunkers, frozen forests, prison hospital wards, and staff cars on country roads. Some were formally executed, hanged either by the regime they had faithfully served or by the Allied victors who sat in judgment at Nuremberg. Some were killed in combat or by random violence during the war's absolutely chaotic final days. Some rotted away for years or even decades in Soviet prison camps, completely forgotten by everyone except the guards who watched over them. And some, perhaps most disturbingly of all, lived for many comfortable years or even decades after the war ended, writing sanitized memoirs, advising new armies, testifying at trials, and insisting with their dying breaths that they had merely been soldiers, that they had simply followed orders from their lawful superiors, that the crimes and atrocities were always someone else's responsibility, never their own. The pattern that emerges from these 26 individual fates is absolutely unmistakable and deeply troubling. Military rank did not protect these men from ultimate accountability. Tactical brilliance and operational genius did not protect them. Personal loyalty to Adolf Hitler most certainly did not protect them. Some of Hitler's most devoted and fanatical followers died in complete disgrace and agony, while some of his most persistent critics somehow managed to survive into comfortable old age. What emerges most clearly from this complete historical accounting is a portrait of complicity and its inevitable cost across every level of moral compromise. These 26 men built the military machine of Nazi conquest with their professional expertise and experience. They maintained that machine with their obedience and accommodation. They oiled its gears with their willingness to look away from atrocity. They watched that machine systematically grind through millions upon millions of human lives across an entire continent. And when that machine finally broke apart completely in fire, rubble, and absolute ruin, the shrapnel from that explosion found every single one of them eventually, in one form or another. 26 men who wore the Golden Baton. 26 different endings. Some swift and violent, some slow and agonizing, some quiet and peaceful. But every single one of them answered in some way, whether in a courtroom, in a prison camp, by their own hand, or simply through the judgment of history that has never stopped rendering its verdict on their lives and choices. The ledger is now complete and closed. The accounting is finished. If this story has moved you or made you think differently about justice, accountability, and the price of moral compromise, please subscribe to this channel and watch the video appearing on your screen right now, because this is just one chapter in the much larger story of how the architects of the Second World War ultimately faced their reckoning, and there are many more chapters still to be told.